Most men lose themselves chasing attention, validation, and love. But high-value men, they know how to care without becoming emotionally dependent. Emotional attachment can make a man weak, anxious, and emotionally unstable. Many men become obsessed with one woman and slowly lose their focus, confidence, and peace. But high-value men think differently. They understand that emotional control is power. They do not beg for love. They do not chase validation, and they never allow emotions to control their decisions. This is not about becoming cold or toxic. It is about protecting your peace, your purpose, and your self-respect. In this video, we'll go through 5 powerful ways high-value men emotionally detach from women while still remaining calm, confident, and masculine. Comment, I choose strength, if you're ready to watch till the end. Before we begin, I am currently working on the Stoic Relationship Blueprint for Men course that's coming in the coming weeks. This course is designed to completely transform the way you think, act, and operate in relationships by helping you master emotional control, self-respect, discipline, confidence, boundaries, female psychology, and true masculine peace, so you stop chasing validation and finally become the man women naturally respect and desire. It breaks down everything step by step in a simple, practical, and powerful way, so any man can fully understand, apply, and permanently develop these principles into his daily life, mindset, relationships, and future. Number 1. They never chase. High-value men do not force attention. The average man spends years exhausting himself trying to earn affection from a woman who already made up her mind about him long ago, and that is exactly why he stays trapped in emotional confusion, constantly analyzing her behavior, waiting for her messages, watching her energy change, wondering why she acts warm one day and cold the next, while he slowly loses his focus, confidence, discipline, and self-respect, trying to maintain a connection that survives only because he keeps carrying it alone. And the painful truth many men avoid accepting is that a woman who truly values a man does not create constant uncertainty inside his mind, because genuine desire is naturally consistent while manipulation thrives on inconsistency. And many men remain emotionally attached because they mistake emotional highs and lows for deep connection, when in reality they are simply addicted to the anxiety of not knowing where they stand. And she notices this immediately because women are highly sensitive to emotional weakness. They notice when a man becomes overly available, overly accommodating, overly eager to please. And the moment she senses that his emotional stability depends on her validation, the dynamic changes, because she no longer sees a grounded man focused on his purpose. She sees a man slowly centering his life around her reactions, and this is why high-value men never chase, because they understand that chasing places a woman above their mission, above their standards, above their peace. And once that happens, the relationship becomes emotionally unbalanced from the start. And many men know exactly what this looks like because they live through it every single day, staring at their phone late at night, wondering why she viewed the message but did not respond, replaying conversations in their head, trying to decode hidden meanings inside simple texts, giving endless chances after disrespect because they fear losing access to her attention, pretending not to notice when her interest drops because they hope effort will somehow restore the version of her that existed at the beginning. But high-value men understand a painful reality that changes everything once fully accepted. When a woman truly wants a man, confusion is minimal, games are minimal, mixed signals are minimal, because genuine interest does not require constant emotional investigation. And this realization frees a man from one of the biggest traps destroying his mental clarity, which is the belief that more effort automatically creates more attraction, because many men are taught that if they simply care harder, love harder, sacrifice harder, stay patient longer. Eventually she will appreciate them. Yet life repeatedly shows the opposite, because women often lose attraction when a man abandons himself emotionally trying to keep her. And this is why Stoic discipline becomes powerful, because it teaches a man to remain centered regardless of her behavior, to observe without immediately reacting, to maintain standards without emotional desperation, and to stop allowing temporary emotions to control permanent decisions, because the average man panics when her energy changes, while the high-value man watches calmly and pays attention to patterns instead of promises, actions instead of words, consistency instead of temporary emotional performances. And this changes everything because he no longer becomes hypnotized by potential. He focuses on reality, and reality tells him everything he needs to know if he has the discipline to accept it honestly. Because deep down, many men already notice when a woman is slowly emotionally checking out, yet continue chasing anyway, hoping persistence will restore attraction, and this destroys them internally, because every ignored message, every cancelled plan, every emotional inconsistency slowly chips away at their dignity, while she loses more respect for him, the more he tolerates behavior he secretly knows he should walk away from. And this is why emotional detachment becomes necessary, because it allows a man to think clearly instead of emotionally. And once he learns to emotionally detach, he stops treating every woman like his final opportunity for happiness. He stops overvaluing beauty while ignoring character. He stops placing women on pedestals while abandoning his standards. And he starts understanding that desperation is never attractive, no matter how society tries to romanticize it, because women rarely respect the man who constantly abandons himself, trying to keep them comfortable. They respect the man who remains grounded in his values, even if it risks losing her. And many men struggle with this because they fear loneliness more than disrespect, so they stay inside emotionally draining situations, hoping small moments of affection will compensate for the anxiety, confusion, and instability consuming their peace. But high-value men understand something that changes their lives completely. Temporary loneliness is far less damaging than permanent emotional dependence, because once a man becomes emotionally dependent on female validation, he loses control over himself. His mood changes based on her attention, his confidence rises and falls based on her behavior, and his peace disappears the moment she pulls away. And that is not strength, that is emotional captivity disguised as love, which is why disciplined men focus heavily on building themselves physically, mentally, financially, and spiritually, because they know purpose creates emotional stability, and emotional stability prevents obsession, because when a man has no direction outside women, he naturally becomes consumed by them. He overthinks every interaction because he has nothing larger anchoring his identity. But when his life is driven by purpose, his emotional world changes completely, because women become additions to his life instead of the center of it. And ironically, this often increases attraction, because emotional independence creates presence, calmness, and confidence, while desperation creates tension, anxiety, and neediness. And this is why high-value men never chase endlessly, because they understand attention gained through pressure is temporary, while genuine desire appears naturally when a man respects himself enough to walk away from situations that continuously damage his peace. And many men transform their lives the moment they finally stop asking, "How do I make her choose me?" and start asking, "Why am I abandoning myself trying to earn attention from someone who continuously shows me where I stand?" Because that question forces painful but necessary introspection, and introspection is where real masculine growth begins. That is exactly why I created the Stoic Relationship Blueprint ebook for men, filled with timeless Stoic principles designed to help you break emotional dependence, regain self-respect, master your emotions, understand women clearly, and rebuild yourself into a calmer, stronger, more disciplined man, and it is now also available in the audiobook version, so you can listen while walking, driving, training, jogging, or sitting alone, reflecting on your life and where you truly want to go as a man. This is not temporary motivation that disappears after one day. This is life-changing knowledge linked in the comments that becomes yours permanently, allowing you to return to it whenever life tests you, whenever emotions cloud your judgment, and whenever you need guidance to recenter yourself and continue evolving into the man you know you are capable of becoming. Number 2. They control their emotions. Most men react emotionally. The average man allows one woman's behavior to completely disrupt his mental state because he builds emotional attachment before building emotional discipline, and this is why so many men wake up anxious, distracted, emotionally exhausted, unable to focus on their goals, because their entire nervous system becomes tied to whether she responds warmly, whether she seems interested today, whether her attention increases or decreases, and women notice this instantly because emotional instability reveals itself through small behaviors men often overlook, through impulsive texting, emotional over-explaining, constant reassurance-seeking, frustration disguised as communication, and the inability to remain calm when uncertainty appears. And the difficult truth many men avoid accepting is that uncontrolled emotions push women away far faster than silence ever could, because emotional self-control is one of the strongest forms of masculine presence, and high-value men understand this deeply, which is why they train themselves to pause before reacting, observe before speaking, and think before emotionally investing themselves into temporary situations, because they know emotions distort perception. And when emotions dominate the mind, a man stops seeing reality clearly. He begins creating stories inside his head based on fear, attachment, insecurity, and fantasy instead of facts. And many men experience this constantly without realizing how destructive it becomes over time, because one delayed response suddenly convinces him she lost interest. One dry conversation suddenly makes him question his worth. One disagreement suddenly sends him into panic, trying to repair something that may not even be broken. And this emotional instability silently destroys his confidence because he becomes psychologically dependent on female consistency for inner peace. But high-value men refuse to live this way because they understand that emotional reactions often create the very outcomes they fear most. And this is why Stoic discipline becomes life-changing for men, because it teaches them to separate emotions from reality, to stop treating every emotional impulse as truth, and to regain control over the mind instead of becoming enslaved by temporary emotional discomfort, because many men secretly suffer from over-attachment while pretending externally that everything is fine. Yet internally they are constantly overthinking, constantly checking phones, constantly replaying interactions, constantly wondering where they stand, and this mental exhaustion slowly drains ambition, focus, productivity, and self-respect until women unknowingly become the center of their emotional universe. And once a man reaches that point, he becomes weak in ways he does not even notice, because his decisions stop being guided by principles and start being guided by fear of losing her, fear of upsetting her, fear of being replaced, fear of being alone, and fear-driven behavior always destroys masculine presence, because fear makes men emotionally reactive, while discipline makes men emotionally grounded. And this distinction changes everything, because women often test emotional strength indirectly through inconsistency, emotional distance, mood changes, and subtle provocations to see whether a man remains centered or emotionally collapses under pressure. And many men fail these tests immediately because they become reactive, defensive, needy, emotionally intense, or desperate for reassurance instead of remaining calm and self-controlled. And once a woman senses she can easily control a man's emotions, the relationship dynamic shifts permanently, because she no longer sees emotional leadership. She sees emotional dependency, and emotional dependency eventually destroys attraction, because no woman truly respects a man who cannot govern himself emotionally. And this is why high-value men place enormous importance on internal discipline, because they understand the strongest man is not the loudest man or the most aggressive man, but the man who remains calm when emotions tempt him to lose control, because real strength reveals itself through composure, patience, restraint, and clarity under pressure. And many men completely transform their lives once they stop reacting impulsively and start observing situations objectively, because they begin noticing patterns they ignored before. They begin recognizing manipulation they previously tolerated. They begin seeing how often they sacrificed their dignity for temporary affection. And this awareness becomes powerful, because awareness creates freedom. And freedom allows a man to emotionally detach from situations that continuously drain his peace, because emotional detachment is not about becoming cold toward women. It is about refusing to let emotions override logic, standards, and self-respect. And once a man truly masters this mindset, his entire presence changes, because he stops trying to control women and starts controlling himself. He stops obsessing over outcomes and starts focusing on his own growth. He stops collapsing emotionally every time life becomes uncomfortable and starts understanding that discomfort is part of masculine development. And this creates a level of calmness many men spend their entire lives searching for, because they finally realize peace does not come from controlling women. It comes from controlling their own mind, and when a man reaches that point, something powerful happens internally, because he no longer fears losing people the same way he once did. He no longer tolerates disrespect just to avoid loneliness. He no longer overextends himself, trying to prove his value to women who continuously take without reciprocating. And instead, he develops standards, emotional stability, and quiet confidence rooted in self-respect, rather than female approval. And this is why emotionally disciplined men move differently through life, because they understand that temporary emotions should never have permanent authority over their decisions. And the moment a man fully accepts this principle, he begins reclaiming control over every area of his life. Number 3. They stay focused on purpose. One of the biggest reasons men become emotionally attached is because they have no bigger mission. When a man wakes up without direction, without discipline, without something meaningful demanding his energy every single day, his mind naturally drifts toward women, because an empty life always searches for emotional stimulation to fill the silence. And this is exactly why so many men become consumed by one woman so quickly, because she becomes excitement inside a life that lacks structure, purpose, and momentum. And the dangerous part is that many men mistake emotional obsession for love, when in reality they are simply attaching themselves to the only thing temporarily giving their life emotional intensity. And this creates a cycle that quietly destroys ambition, because the more emotionally attached a man becomes, the less focused he becomes on building himself, and suddenly his priorities shift without him realizing it, because instead of focusing on his body, his money, his future, his discipline, and his growth, he starts centering his mental energy around her attention, her moods, her behavior, and whether she still desires him. And this weakens him internally, because he slowly loses control over his own focus, while she becomes the emotional center of his existence. And many men are trapped inside this exact situation right now, waking up checking their phone before checking their goals, neglecting opportunities because they are mentally consumed by relationship anxiety, losing motivation in the gym because her emotional distance destroys their confidence, abandoning routines and standards, trying to maintain access to a woman whose interest constantly fluctuates depending on her emotions. And the painful reality many men avoid accepting is that women rarely respect a man who abandons his mission for them, because women are naturally drawn toward men whose lives already possess structure, direction, emotional control, and purpose beyond female validation. And the moment a man begins orbiting around her emotionally, she often starts losing attraction, even if she never says it directly, because deep down she wants to experience a man whose life is stable with or without her presence, not a man who emotionally collapses the moment she pulls away slightly. And this is why purpose becomes one of the strongest forms of emotional detachment, because a man focused on building his life simply does not have unlimited energy available for emotional obsession, and this changes his psychology completely, because instead of chasing emotional highs from women, he starts gaining fulfillment from discipline, progress, achievement, self-respect, physical improvement, financial growth, and personal mastery. And this creates a calmness many men have never experienced, because their emotional state no longer depends entirely on female attention. And the controversial truth many men eventually discover is that women often enter a man's life more peacefully when he stops making them his primary focus, because desperation creates pressure, while purpose creates presence. And presence is powerful, because women notice when a man genuinely values his time, his energy, and his mission. And many men struggle with this because society constantly teaches them that relationships should become the center of their emotional world. Yet this mindset silently destroys them, because once a man makes a woman his entire source of happiness, he unconsciously hands her complete control over his emotional state. And this is why Stoic discipline becomes essential, because it teaches a man to remain rooted inside himself instead of constantly seeking emotional security through external validation. And many men desperately need this realization because they spend years trying to become more desirable to women while completely neglecting the deeper issue, which is that they have not built a life they themselves genuinely respect yet. And once a man starts building that life, everything changes internally, because he stops operating from emotional scarcity, he stops panicking when a woman becomes distant, he stops tolerating disrespect just because she is attractive, and he stops confusing attention with genuine connection because his standards rise naturally alongside his self-respect. And this transformation becomes visible in every area of his life, because purpose sharpens a man mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. It gives him discipline during difficult periods, stability during uncertainty, and direction during emotional discomfort. And this is why high-value men remain focused on their mission, regardless of who enters or leaves their life, because they understand something deeply important. Women are attracted to the byproduct of a disciplined life, not to a man who abandons himself emotionally trying to maintain their approval, and many men secretly fear focusing too heavily on themselves because they think it will push women away. But ironically, the opposite happens, because when a man genuinely builds himself, his energy changes completely. He becomes calmer, less needy, more confident, more emotionally stable, and more selective with who receives access to his time and attention. And this naturally increases his value because he no longer seeks women from desperation. He chooses women from abundance and self-respect. And this is where emotional freedom begins, because once a man discovers meaning beyond women, he stops viewing relationships as emotional survival and starts viewing them as healthy additions to an already meaningful life. And that mindset changes everything, because he finally understands that his purpose must always remain stronger than his attachment. Number 4. They accept loss. Most emotional pain comes from resistance. The average man spends months or even years mentally fighting reality, because he cannot accept that a woman he deeply invested in emotionally has changed, lost interest, emotionally disconnected, or chosen a different direction. And instead of accepting what is clearly happening in front of him, he desperately searches for explanations that protect his attachment, because acceptance feels painful while denial gives temporary comfort. And this is why so many men remain trapped emotionally long after a relationship is already finished, because they continue negotiating with reality inside their own mind. Hoping effort, patience, emotional sacrifice, or loyalty will somehow restore the version of her they originally fell in love with. But high-value men understand something many men spend their entire lives avoiding. People change, emotions change, attraction changes, and no amount of emotional desperation can force permanence onto human nature. And this realization becomes liberating once fully accepted, because a man finally stops exhausting himself, trying to control outcomes he never truly controlled to begin with. And many men know exactly how devastating attachment becomes once a woman emotionally distances herself, because suddenly every interaction starts carrying emotional weight. Every conversation becomes analyzed, every moment of coldness becomes painful, and the man slowly loses himself, trying to regain emotional certainty from someone who no longer offers it naturally. And this destroys him internally, because he begins bargaining away pieces of his dignity just to maintain temporary emotional access to her, tolerating disrespect he would never normally accept, lowering standards he once valued, and remaining available to someone who continuously shows through actions that her investment no longer matches his. And the painful truth many men refuse to confront is that women often emotionally leave long before they physically leave. And by the time many men notice the shift, they are already emotionally dependent on, restoring what has been fading for months, which is why Stoic acceptance becomes one of the strongest forms of masculine strength, because it teaches a man to face painful reality directly instead of emotionally escaping into denial, fantasy, or false hope. And this mindset transforms everything, because a man finally stops asking, "How do I stop her from leaving?" and starts asking, "Why am I trying to hold on to someone who clearly no longer values my presence the same way?" Because that question forces brutal honesty, and brutal honesty is where emotional freedom begins. And many men avoid this stage because acceptance initially feels like loss, while attachment feels safer, even when it is destroying them emotionally. But what they eventually discover is that resisting reality creates far more suffering than reality itself, because emotional exhaustion comes not only from losing someone, but from mentally refusing to let go after the truth already became obvious. And this is why emotionally disciplined men develop the ability to release people with dignity instead of clinging to situations that continuously damage their peace, because they understand that trying to force someone to stay rarely creates love. It creates imbalance, emotional dependency, and resentment. And many men need to hear this clearly, because they spend years blaming themselves for women whose behavior had nothing to do with their worth, constantly wondering whether they could have texted differently, acted differently, loved harder, or sacrificed more, while ignoring the deeper reality that genuine desire cannot be negotiated into existence through effort alone. And this realization changes a man profoundly, because he stops internalizing every failed relationship as proof of inadequacy and starts recognizing that some connections simply run their course, regardless of how deeply he cared. And once he accepts this, his emotional world becomes calmer, because he no longer sees endings as personal destruction. He sees them as natural transitions inside life, and this mindset creates enormous psychological strength, because he stops fearing loss the way he once did, and fear is exactly what keeps many men trapped inside unhealthy dynamics, because they become so terrified of being alone that they tolerate manipulation, disrespect, emotional inconsistency, and psychological exhaustion just to avoid facing temporary loneliness. But high-value men understand something transformative. Loneliness is temporary, while self-abandonment creates lasting damage. And this is why emotionally strong men choose dignity over emotional dependency, even when it hurts, because they know peace cannot exist where self-respect constantly gets compromised. And once a man truly accepts that some people are not meant to remain in his life forever, he becomes emotionally freer than most men ever experience, because he stops gripping desperately onto relationships out of fear and starts appreciating connections without emotionally enslaving himself to them. And this shift changes everything, because he finally realizes that his strength does not come from preventing loss. It comes from knowing he can survive it without losing himself. Number 5. They protect their peace. High-value men do not entertain chaos for too long. The average man stays emotionally attached to situations that are clearly draining him because he becomes addicted to emotional inconsistency without even realizing it. And this is why so many men remain trapped inside exhausting relationships where confusion replaces peace, anxiety replaces clarity, and emotional tension becomes normalized simply because they fear walking away from someone they still desire. And many men silently tolerate behavior that slowly destroys their confidence because they keep hoping she will eventually become consistent, respectful, emotionally stable, and appreciative if they simply remain patient long enough. But high-value men understand something deeply important that emotionally desperate men struggle to accept. When a woman continuously disturbs your peace, ignores your standards, manipulates your emotions, creates uncertainty, and repeatedly drains your mental stability, her presence eventually becomes more expensive than her absence. And this realization changes everything, because a man finally stops measuring relationships only through attraction and starts measuring them through the quality of life they create inside him. And many men desperately need this perspective because they remain emotionally attached to women who consistently leave them mentally exhausted, unable to focus, emotionally unstable, and disconnected from themselves. Yet they continue staying because loneliness scares them more than dysfunction, and this creates one of the most dangerous emotional traps a man can experience, because he slowly adapts to emotional instability until suffering starts feeling normal. And the controversial truth many men eventually discover is that some women subconsciously thrive on emotional chaos, because chaos gives them attention, emotional leverage, and control over emotionally reactive men. And this is exactly why emotional discipline becomes so powerful, because a calm man cannot easily be manipulated through emotional inconsistency, guilt, mixed signals, or emotional games. And many women lose influence the moment a man stops reacting impulsively to every emotional shift they create, because emotional reactions give away power while calm observation preserves it. And this is why Stoic principles transform men so deeply, because they teach a man to prioritize internal stability above temporary emotional gratification, to stop sacrificing long-term peace for short-term emotional attachment, and to remain emotionally grounded regardless of external circumstances. And many men know exactly what emotional chaos looks like because they live through it constantly, waking up anxious after arguments that never truly get resolved, constantly defending themselves against accusations designed to create guilt, walking on emotional eggshells trying to avoid upsetting her, over-explaining themselves, hoping she finally understands their intentions, apologizing repeatedly just to restore temporary peace, even when they know they were not entirely wrong. And over time, this slowly destroys masculine confidence, because the man becomes psychologically conditioned to prioritize emotional survival over authenticity. And once this happens, he starts losing touch with his own standards, his own voice, and his own emotional center, because his entire focus shifts toward maintaining stability inside a relationship that continuously destabilizes him. But high-value men refuse to live this way because they understand peace is one of the most valuable assets a man possesses, and protecting it requires boundaries, emotional discipline, self-respect, and the willingness to walk away from people who repeatedly damage it, regardless of attraction, history, or emotional attachment. And this is where many men fail because they confuse unconditional tolerance with strength, when in reality, constant tolerance of disrespect usually reveals fear of loss rather than emotional maturity. And women notice this because when a man repeatedly accepts behavior that violates his peace without consequences, she unconsciously loses respect for his boundaries, and this creates even more imbalance because emotional weakness invites further emotional testing. And this is why emotionally strong men remain grounded in standards instead of emotions, because standards protect them during moments where emotions try to convince them to tolerate situations damaging their dignity, and many men transform their lives the moment they finally understand that protecting peace is not selfish, cold, or emotionally unavailable. It is necessary for psychological survival in a world where emotionally undisciplined people constantly project chaos onto others, and once a man fully embraces this mindset, his entire energy changes because he stops arguing endlessly, trying to force understanding from people committed to misunderstanding him. He stops chasing closure from women whose actions already provided all the closure necessary. He stops sacrificing sleep, discipline, ambition, and mental clarity, trying to maintain relationships built on instability, and instead he becomes deeply selective about who receives access to his emotional world, because he understands that not everyone deserves intimate access to his mind, time, attention, and energy. And this creates a level of emotional freedom many men never experience because they spend their entire lives prioritizing attachment over peace. And the powerful truth is that a peaceful man becomes extremely difficult to manipulate because his happiness no longer depends on controlling people, convincing people, or keeping people. And once a man reaches that level of emotional discipline, he finally understands something life-changing. Protecting his peace is not weakness, it is self-respect in its highest form. Society trains men to chase validation, tolerate disrespect, ignore their instincts, and remain emotionally weak because a man who fully understands himself becomes impossible to manipulate. Which is exactly why the Stoic Relationship Blueprint ebook for men is so powerful, filled with timeless Stoic principles that immediately transform the way you think, move, handle women, control emotions, and rebuild your self-respect from the inside out. And it is now available in the audiobook version, so you can listen while walking alone at night, training in the gym, driving, jogging, or reflecting deeply on the direction of your life as a man. Comment: peace over attachment. If you are ready to break emotional dependence, reclaim your mind, and grab this life-changing book linked in the comments before more years disappear, chasing people who never truly value your presence. Like this video and subscribe to help more men discover these truths, wake up emotionally, protect their peace, and avoid the silent destruction that comes from building their lives around women instead of building themselves first.